Hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. This episode is sponsored by Trekell Art Supplies. For over 30 years, Trekell has been obsessed with the art of brush making, and now they're applying that same obsession to professional-grade artist panels. Both their brushes and panels are made right here in California at their Hesperia factory. Go to Trekell.com and use promo code SAVVY16 to get 15% off your next order. My guest today is Krista Harris. Krista is an abstract painter living in Southwest Colorado. She thinks of her paintings as maps or environments, and she loves to play with synesthesia. Synesthesia is that sensation that some people have when one sense is being interpreted by a different one. Sounds kind of strange, I know. So, for example, some people see a color when a number is mentioned, or maybe they smell lemon when they see a particular shade of green. Krista likes to explore the natural environment around her through not only sight, but sound, smell, and touch as well. So she's really playing around with that idea of synesthesia in her work. We talk about her insights as a sort of late bloomer. Krista didn't focus fully on her paintings until she was 49 years old. And we also discuss something that it's a personal favorite of mine. I love talking about this, which is driving your own bus. Meaning taking control of your life and making concrete decisions and plans that you can measure and gauge your progress with. We also talk about why she switched from representational painting to abstract work, how abstraction allows the artist to paint without naming things. Krista approaches her work from that non-thinking place. And the minute that she starts thinking about how she wants the painting to go, or another artist that might remind her of, or anything at all that is a distraction in that moment, she consciously pushes it aside to maintain presence with her work in that moment. I really enjoyed this conversation with Krista, and I hope it gets you thinking differently about your own work. So here is Krista Harris. Hey, Krista, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter podcast. I'm delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Antrice. I'm really excited to talk to you as well.
Can you tell me, was there an artist that you admired when you were younger that inspired you to be an artist yourself?
You know, of all the questions I thought you might ask me, that one stumped me from the beginning. So I'm glad we're getting that one on the table, because I really had to kind of go back and sort of scratch my head and try and recall. And, you know, when I was really young, probably 6th or 7th grade, I was so enamored of Norman Rockwell's work. Mm-hmm. And I guess it was the human component, you know, the expressions. I love to draw, and I love to draw people. And there wasn't anyone out there better at it than he was to me at that age. And so I spent, you know, a fair amount of time just really studying his work at an early age, and then kind of moving on from there. But I'd have to say that he was an early influence.
Mine would have been Arthur Rackham. He's an illustrator of children's, mostly fairy tales, but like the Grimm fairy tales. And he did Edgar Allan Poe and all these really detailed drawings. But yeah, stuff like that, like really when you're a kid and you like really there's something about an image that really grabs your attention. And Norman Rockwell too, I find it interesting when I think about that at about that age, at a very, very young age, I had this sense of nostalgia when I was looking at him. And now I kind of like, at 12 years old, really, I had nostalgia.
As if you were, a mature adult and your life wasn't before you. But that when you said that about Arthur Rackham, it reminded me too that I had then, and I still have the same volume, but it was one of those, it was an encyclopedia that had belonged to my mother. And it was this one volume that was just filled with illustrations and poetry and children's stories. And it was just, you know, I was so fascinated by that. I would just pore over these, you know, Art Nouveau drawings and paintings that just really captured my imagination. So that probably preceded Norman Rockwell even. So
can you sort of pinpoint or tell a story of, do you remember when you decided that you were going to pursue art?
I was one of those kids that just always thought, I guess maybe I believed it when my mother told me that I was an artist, that I could do anything. And my mother, saved my drawings from like the age of 5. I think I had a turtle or, something that she still has to this day. And then when I was in kindergarten, I remember this time when our kindergarten teacher lived across the street from us. And, it was, early on in the year or something. And she came to our door and I thought, uh-oh, I am in big trouble. Or something that I did at school. But she came because she had this drawing that I had done, in kindergarten of my mother vacuuming the house or something. And she just went on and on about this drawing forever. And so I guess that was the turning point for me. Kindergarten. I was just sure I was on the path to, fame or fortune. And it never changed. It's just how I always have identified myself and, found my place and my footing in the world, where I felt comfortable and confident and was just really who I was. And I can remember going off to college and, sitting in my room packing and my mother saying to me, she said, well, what are you going to major in? And I said, well, art, of course, there was never a question for me. What else was, I wasn't going to be a mathematician. But so she said, honey, take some secretarial courses. I think she just wanted me to have a backup plan, but I never did. I never learned to type or anything. I just went right into art school and, never looked back. So,
did you ever feel like you needed that backup?
If I had known there were going to be computers, I might have learned to type a little better.
And actually, yeah, it does come in handy, doesn't it?
It does come in handy. I hate to say that I still have to look at the keyboard to do any serious typing, but no, I if I had a backup, I might have taken it, and without a backup, I just had to move forward in the field of art and design, and I've been lucky with that all my life.
Can you share what your experience was after college? So you now are armed with your degree, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then you're off into the big bad world. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got started and some of the things that happened during that time?
Yeah. So when I went to art school, I got a Bachelor of Fine Arts in painting and jewelry design. And I can remember in one of my classes, one of our professors saying 2% of us would succeed, as artists. And I remember just looking around the room and thinking, well, I'm going to be one of them. I don't know about you guys.
What are all these people going to do with their lives?
That self-confidence must have only been based on youth because that's all I had going for me. But so, and the other thing was they didn't really teach you anything. I mean, I had, fantastic classes in color theory and drawing, but they didn't really teach you anything about the business of art.
Like, I've never heard of anyone who does.
No. And so I can remember getting out of school. And in those days, it wasn't an option to go home and live with your family either. You get out of school and you just think, oh God, I have to make a living now, and what am I going to do? And I had some friends at the time that worked for NC State University. I guess it was the design department. They produced a lot of publications at the time and they did a lot of different things. And so, I kind of called in some favors and I didn't know, not only would I not learn to type, but I also refused to learn how to do any commercial design. Anything practical. So, there I was thinking, I don't have a single practical skill, but the NC State Fair, I think, was going on at the time, and they hired me to do some exhibit work, temporarily, and then kind of kept me on. And it turned out that I was I was so fortunate, because there was a woman that worked at NC State at the time who was just a fantastic designer, and, went on to work in New York, and she and I became close friends, and she was really interested in painting, and I was really interested in design. So she shared a lot of the love of graphic design with me. And, slowly but surely I learned the trade. And those were in the days that you were literally cutting type apart with an X-Acto, doing everything by hand. But I picked up, enough graphic design, and I went on and had, moved to Denver, Boulder after that, and worked for a number of years as an illustrator, and it really suited me. It sort of satisfied that creative part of my existence, and you kind of work on your own terms. And
as a freelance designer?
Yeah, I worked with a number of firms and art director positions and that kind of thing, and then basically worked for myself.
When did you decide to make the leap? And a tangent question to that is, was there something that pushed you to do that, or was it just time?
It was just a classic case of things that sort of collided. And I think I was about 49 at the time, and just about to turn 50. And my father had just recently died. And I kind of looked, and I just looked around and went, the time is finite. And here are the things that I haven't done. And I thought, well, I've never been to Europe. I've never been to Paris. And, I've always considered myself a painter, but, at that point I had been in, the business of graphics for long enough that I knew how to conduct myself as a business person. And I just really finally got it, better late than never, that, art is a business. And you have to treat it like that, and conduct yourself as a business person. And so I knew I had those skills to fall back on. And I also was at that point where I just thought I didn't have anything to lose. I was less afraid of getting shot down than not having tried it,
Oh, yeah. That's huge. That right there is a really, really important kind of pivot to recognize that the pain of not doing it eventually becomes greater than whatever it is that you're fearing is going to happen.
Absolutely. And I had been exhibiting a little bit locally and showing at some art centers. And so, I had gotten my feet wet and had some success and some experience, but, it just gave me enough confidence to say, I just said, well, I'm going to try it. I'm just going to quit doing what I was doing, and I was going to devote myself to painting for, at that time, I think I had decided I could give it a year, maybe a year and a half, and see what would happen in that amount of time. And it was, really good timing, and a lot of good circumstances sort of came together. And
in hindsight, do you feel like there were any, I'm going to make you brag a little bit here.
Sure.
In hindsight, do you feel like there were any decisions that you made that were particularly smart, and you were like, looking back now, you're like, wow, that was a pretty good move?
Well, you really do have to. One of the things that's difficult is that I think you really do have to constantly check in with your goals. You have to, I would make an annual sort of, business plan or wish list of goals, things that I wanted to achieve. And whatever I came up with, I would sort of raise the bar a little bit. So let's just say I might think that I wanted to get a gallery in California or something like that. I would kind of hone that down a little bit, and I would say, I'd like to be in a gallery in this area of this caliber. And, I'd like to have a one-person show, and I'd like to have that one-person show sell out. So it didn't help. It didn't hurt for me to have really high expectations. And
I love this.
It's so surprising that, it's that thing about naming what you want.
Yes.
As simple as it sounds, and as often as you hear it in life, it's so powerful, and it really helps you clarify it. And I think, as artists, we need to really think about, what our work means, where we want it to go, what we want it to accomplish, how we might go about doing that. And, there's lots of different avenues for artists to follow. And you just have to basically have a mission statement, just like you would for, a corporation or something. I think it's really important to have written intentions and
make them crystal clear. Like that's the other thing. I think a common mistake that artists make is to just say, something really vague, like I want to be in a gallery. And I love the way you sort of honed in on that by saying that I want to be in this caliber of gallery in this general location, and I want my first, and I want to sell out my show. Like the thing is to just, for me at least, like I feel like once you have something that's that clear, and I even, you even go down even further, but you have something really, really clear, then you can sort of back it up and start going, okay, so if I want to sell out a show, what do I need to do?
Right.
And you can start thinking of ways to, bring in collectors who like your work, bring in the people who are most likely to buy.
Right.
I think there's the assumption is when you say something like that, I think people kind of jump to conclusions, and maybe it raises their hackles a little bit, because if you say, I want to sell out a show, a lot of times the assumption is, okay, then what do I need to paint in order that will sell?
Right.
Like that seems to be the only logical conclusion to that goal, which is so not true.
It's not true. And the other part of that, so it wouldn't, let's just say those were my goals. But the bigger part of my goal would be that, I want my work to grow and mature and to become even more proficient or challenging, or, I would define what I wanted my work to be.
Absolutely.
And sort of filter down from there, about the business part of it. Because, and a question I had to ask myself early on was how important it was to me to sell my work, which seems like a kind of a silly question, but I know artists that really don't like to sell their work. They're very attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me a while to figure out that I like my work to move out of the studio. I get depressed if it's just piling up against the wall. And, I like to have places to exhibit it and, feel like it is out in the world and it's moving around. It's kind of like sending your kid off to college or something. So just that sense of accomplishment, that maybe it'll go to a good home sort of thing. But you have to really do some soul searching to think about, what you want and how you want your work to look and be perceived, and how you might make that happen.
Yeah, so true. I think it's very easy to go on autopilot and hope that everything just turns out okay. I will always say that, the first and foremost, you need to hone your craft and work on your art, but it doesn't stop there.
Right. Never stops. And you never get to the point where you've made it, quote unquote. There's no such thing. You show up in your studio every day and you do your work, and it's a job. And, some days it's going along great, and the next day you think that you might as well get a job at Walmart because you couldn't paint your way out of a paper bag if you had to. So I don't think it matters how successful you think you are or may have been, or what successes you may have had. It doesn't get any easier. If it does, then you're doing it wrong. I think it has to be, for me, it has to be continually challenging, and I can't ever feel like I'm, sort of regurgitating or repeating or resting on my laurels or, something. So it's the hardest job I've ever had. And I get no end of grief and no respect from my brothers about it, believe me. Every time I start whining about how hard it is, they're both engineers, right? So they just give me no end of grief for this job of being an artist I have. But it is hard work because you're the bookkeeper and the postman and, you basically are.
And the janitor and
and you're pushing that ball uphill all the time, plus trying to keep yourself sane and, engaged in it. So
how do you maintain your sanity in this?
As much as I whine about it sometimes, I'm well aware part of not starting until I was 50 and throwing myself into it full time was, I knew what a gift it was to be able to get up every morning and do that. I wake up every morning thinking about it, what I think about before I fall asleep. And it's just such an exciting time artistically. There's, art is such a broad spectrum these days, and there's so much going on in so many different arenas and so many different mediums and across the world, and we have access to see and experience things that we didn't, or I didn't, when I was in college. So there's no shortage of inspiration.
None. Yeah.
My biggest fear is that I'm going to run out of time before, I feel like I've just got 50 years worth of ideas and energy ahead of me and probably not 50 years to accomplish it. So,
well, can I ask you this question? Because I'm going to ask you this because seriously, just within the last 2 days, I got an email from a woman who basically has kind of come to the point where she realized that she needs to get back to her artwork, and she put it aside to raise a family and to have a career. And she made a lot of sacrifices, and now she's getting back into it. Like, I get these comments all the time, just like, oh my God, I'm fill in the blank. I'm 35. I'm 45. I'm 55. I'm 65. Is it too late for me? Did I waste my whole life? So I'm kind of curious. Did you ever feel that way? Did you ever worry about that? And how did you respond to that?
Well, I don't think I really worried about it. I think it was one of those sort of aha moments that at the time that I really seriously undertook it, I just finally realized that nobody was going to knock on my door and say, hey, we've heard you're an artist and we want to exhibit your work.
What? They don't?
I don't know what I thought was going to happen, but, and I finally just put two and two together and, knew that I could go forward and I could find a way to make it work. So, and I think whenever you start, and from whatever age and from whatever place, that's when you're supposed to start. And the only way to do it is just to begin. And you may not know exactly how you want your work to look or what you want to do, but there are some fantastic workshops out there you can take that can get you jump started now in any particular arena. And, you learn to connect with other artists. And I think networking is really important. I think traveling to museums and seeing as much art as you can is really important. So those are all ways to start. And, I started when my daughter was young, and she was my biggest inspiration, honestly, because I had a space for her in my studio where she had an easel and would set up and paint. And I would go in there, and before I could even get my apron on and get my paints out, so she would have done like 5 fantastic things, just one after another, just done them and ripped them off and had a pile on the floor and gone on. And I would just stand there like with my mouth open. And I just remember one day thinking, that's what I want. I want that joy, that non-judgmental, that immediate, that yes, I'm in the studio and I'm painting and this is what I do. And this is, which is what I'm here for.
Yes.
And I just thought, it's just that childlike acceptance or embracing or looking at the world, that way that, I loved that. And so she was my biggest inspiration, I think.
Oh, I love it. It's like boundless curiosity, enthusiasm, and complete, there's just up until a certain age, kids just have zero self-consciousness. And I wish we could just let them stay there. I wish we as human beings could just be like, okay.
You just spend the rest of your life getting back to that. And statistically, I think they say it's up until age 12, when you start to say, oh, my work doesn't look like that person or that dog or whatever. It doesn't look right. And, up until then, you don't care. I think I drew a chicken with 4 legs one time. As far as I can tell, that was a great chicken. But, and then at some point you have to learn to find your way back to that childlike view of the world. And because that's what we all want. Yeah,
for sure. Can you share a story of a time in your journey when you encountered a big setback or experienced some sort of a big challenge? And most importantly, what did you take away from that?
I think probably the first one I can remember being sort of pivotal for me was I had been exhibiting for maybe 3 years at a gallery locally. And then in 2008, when the financial crisis sort of started, the gallery that I was, and I'd been doing really well with them, and was happy to, just have that one gallery. And even though all along I'd been sending out other portfolios and, trying to introduce my work to other galleries, I think I may have been showing at a gallery in Santa Fe at the time too. But anyway, the gallery that I was in Durango closed.
Uh-huh.
And I just, for about half a day, I just thought, that's it. I was washed up. My career was over. But that wasn't the case at all. And I think, it just made me more determined to succeed. And it was just one of those experiences that make you realize you can never sort of get too comfortable or, rest on any laurels or have any, particular expectations, because I've never seen a business in my life crazier than the art business. And the longer I'm in it, the less I know about it. It just changes so fast. And I just don't think it doesn't proceed along a point-to-point path. It kind of bounces all over the place. And all you can really do is put your head down and do the best work that you can do. You really, at the end of the day, don't have a whole lot of control over some of the crazy things that happen. But it did make me realize that, if I wanted to succeed, I had to kind of constantly be finding ways to do that and figuring out what that meant to me. And so, a setback, it's like one door closes and another door opens, as they say. And that's definitely true for me. And that's good to know. I mean, having those setbacks and overcoming those hurdles is something that you have to do to, it's like when your painting goes south, that it's going to go down that rabbit hole. But, over time, you learn that you build up enough confidence to know that you can pull it back out again. And that's just part of the process. So
nice.
It's a roller coaster.
Yes, it is. This episode is sponsored by Turkel Art Supplies. Brian Turkel started Turkel Art Supplies over 30 years ago from his apartment in Brea, California. Turkel sells direct to artists so that they can keep their quality high and their costs low. What I think makes Turkel special is that they're always looking for ways to develop relationships with artists so that they can serve them better. Here's an example from Brian himself.
It's always allowed me a lifestyle where things are changing constantly. I don't think I could ever really work in an office or a factory or anything like that, because it gets too repetitive. And something new is always going on in this industry. When I was very, very, very small and actually started in my apartment in Brea, I had a customer come over and we sat there at the coffee table and designed a new brush that she thought would really work. And 30 years later, she's very big and she still buys those same brushes. So, those are the types of things that really are a lot of fun.
Go to Trekell.com and use promo code SAVVY16 to get 15% off your next order. And you're right. There's no, well, I don't want to say there's no rest, but almost.
Yeah, there's almost no rest. I mean, there are changes, and there's times, actually now I think I'm sort of doing, instead of my yearly plan, I'm also doing like a 10-year review. Like, where do I want to be in 10 years instead of where do I want to be just next year? And I've actually started to, instead of pushing, I've started to look at reserving my energy and not being a little more selfish with my time. And I was one of those people who said yes to everything. If somebody invited me to exhibit or do this or that, I was like, yeah, sure, I'm doing that. And then,
we sound a lot alike.
Yeah, but you can't keep doing that forever. At some point, you have to be a little more discerning about what you say yes to, because you do realize that really all you have is your energy and your time, and how do you want to use that?
Absolutely.
So that's important to know too.
That's a huge topic. I discussed this with another artist in a different episode, but just this whole concept of when you're not actively steering your own bus or steering your own boat or whatever you want to call it, you're going to drift into places that you didn't intend to go, or you're going to be, by saying, there's some wonderful things that happen by saying yes to things. But that notion that you mentioned of conserving your energy I think is really even more crucial for artists than for anyone else, because art requires so much of your thoughtful time and solitude and all of that. And when you allow other people to drive your schedule, either purposely or passively, you rob yourself of all of those kind of great aha moments that come in the studio when you're just sitting there staring at your painting for 6 hours or whatever it is.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's so true, that I think in art and music and writing that you've got to allow yourself that solitude and that willingness to sort of cut yourself off from outside influences, which there's so many of, more and more, opportunities to, just give your time away. Mm-hmm. And you have to be more and more possessive and sort of selfish about it. And, because that's really where the deep work happens and the magic happens is, in that real solitude.
Yeah, that exactly.
Doesn't usually happen when you're scrolling through things on the internet or something.
No, and I think the most painful thing is when it comes right down to it, or in that regard, we are our worst enemy. And I think culturally, I know there's people listen to this podcast from all over the world, but I think the United States in particular has this culture of busyness. Like, you have to be doing something. You have to be productive. Like, at all moments of the day, you have to be doing something.
Right.
And that's horrible for art.
Yeah, it is horrible for art unless you redefine what doing something is, because doing nothing can be really as productive as, running around. And I've tried to frame it lately. I was reading something that's sort of sparked this, but I try to frame it now in terms of shallow work and deep work.
Are you reading that book by Cal Newport?
Yes, I was. And it was so interesting because my daughter, who's my hero, was also reading something, and she's super smart and, studying engineering and physics and all these things. And she was reading a similar thing, but from that perspective. So I was reading it from from coming from an artist's point of view, and she was reading it from a technology point of view.
The same book.
Same book. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That must have been such a fascinating conversation. Just an interjection here in case people didn't catch that. The book we're talking about is called Deep Work, and it's by Cal Newport. Excellent, excellent read. I highly recommend it. Okay, go on.
It does make you really stop and think. And, there's a certain amount of shallow work that has to happen in our lives every day. And if we name it as shallow work, and we could say, okay, I'm going to do the shallow work for X amount of time so that I can clear my plate and get to the deep work. It just helps you manage it, somehow. So yeah, I love that. Yeah, I'm glad that you remembered the name of the book and the author, because I was drawing a blank.
Yeah, I've got a very geeky streak in me, and I read an enormous amount. So,
and that's a fantastic thing to have and to embrace, and I'm trying to do more of that, because there's just some wonderful art reading out there that can really make you stop and think about it, the process.
Yeah. I'm still, the one thing about that book, the Deep Work book, that really impressed me. So Cal Newport he's a professor, right? And honestly, I don't really remember what he does, but he's a professor. And so he's got to publish a certain number of papers every year. And he ends up publishing like 3 or 4 times the normal amount. What kind of blew my mind was he talked about how I think at one point he was talking about how he was doing this while he had a toddler, a baby, the full-time professorship, and he would still shut everything down without fail at 5:00.
Right.
All the strategies and tactics that he uses are fantastic, and I keep trying to implement them. And so I keep catching myself, like when I'm going for a walk or something, going like, okay, can I train my mind to, be a little bit more focused? But shutting down at 5:30, I've never been able to master that.
That one really, because I remember that same story, and he really didn't waste time. He knew the value of it, and his ability to sort of be present with whatever he was doing, like if he was, when he shut down at 5:30, he didn't turn his computer back on or check emails at night or anything like that. He was there with his family. And then when he was writing, he was there with his writing. And I think that's a big part of it, is just really learning how to focus.
Yes.
And recognizing the value of that, and, not constantly being distracted. And then he does, and the book's interesting because it's written a lot like Malcolm Gladwell's books, who I also love, and he gives these examples over and over again of, different case studies, and how these things work. And so he talks about a lot of different people and how they accomplish what they do. So that's a book that I would recommend.
The Cal Newport one or the Malcolm Gladwell?
Or both. I mean, I remember reading, I think the first one that Malcolm Gladwell wrote that I read was Blink.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just, because that one was sort of based on what we know before we know that we know it.
Yeah, I know, which is kind of mind-bending, right?
I know. And for me, I totally interpreted that artistically, because I realized that part of the reason that I made a transition from doing realistic work, which I did for a very long time, into non-objective or abstract work, was that I, grew dissatisfied and disengaged with realism. But the thing that I love about abstraction is, in realism, I think once you've named something, like once your brain recognizes it, let's say you're walking along and you see some beautiful thing on the ground, and for a second you're just in that sort of fuzzy, happy spot where all you're doing is looking at how gorgeous it is and how beautiful it is and how it makes you feel, and that probably takes a nanosecond. And then your brain says, oh, that's just a squashed piece of wire and some chewing gum or something. And then once you name that, once your brain identifies that and names it, it sort of stops being beautiful.
Yeah, it's like the magic is gone.
Yeah, you've labeled it, so you're done with it. So I was just really fascinated with that, what we see in that brief second, and I'm always trying to recreate something that you can't quite put your finger on, that is just sort of constantly morphing or too organic to sort of nail it down and say it's this or it's that, but you get to kind of constantly reinvent the story around it visually.
That's really interesting. Like one of the, like my personal mind bending moments while I'm painting or whatever is, I was introduced to this concept when I was studying painting in Italy. I guess it's 2 years ago now, 2 summers ago. And one of the concepts that they were trying to get across is to paint without naming it. So to just paint the shapes and stuff. And it made an enormous difference in how I see things, but I constantly have to remind myself not to say that that's a tree, that that's a field, that that's the sky, that that's anything, to just absorb it. And it's so hard. But I love that you kind of pulled that into your abstract work. And that sounds like the catalyst for the change from representational work into abstraction.
Yeah. It was for me. And, it continues to be really challenging, without the same parameters of perspective and, drawing and that kind of thing. But much more rewarding for me, in the long run, because, I continue to engage with it and it changes, from day to day or depending on your mood or depending on the light or whatever. I think for me, I continue to have a conversation with the work that kind of grows with me. So
can you talk a little bit about, I'm asking you a question that somebody recently asked me, and I'm laughing because I know how hard this is going to be to answer. So,
okay.
So I apologize in advance. But it's interesting because the question that I was talking to somebody who's collected my work before, and I was like, the question I asked her was, if you could be a fly on the wall in an artist's studio, what would you want to discover? And her answer was, I want to know what are you thinking when you're doing this? So I'm kind of curious, given what we were just talking about, can you talk a little bit about when you start a painting or when you start working on a motif, what is going on in your head?
That's
an evil meme question.
That actually is, for me, is not that hard of a question, because the answer is, I think the best place to paint from is that non-thinking place where your brain is turned off and you just begin, and there's no judgment going on, and I don't have anything in my mind. So the answer is I have nothing in my mind when I started painting, because that's where I do my best work. The minute I start thinking about somebody else's work, for instance, or that I want this to go a certain way, or even if a narrative starts to creep into my subconscious, I do everything I can to turn that back off. It has to happen at some point, but at the beginning, I just try to keep everything at bay for as long as possible, because that to me is just, where the birth of the painting happens. And at some point it will start to tell you where it wants to go, or you'll start to get clues, or you'll start to have to think about things. You will have to sit down and start to think about composition and push and pull and light and dark and breathing room and, symmetry, those kinds of things. But I try and put that off for as long as I can. Sometimes I'll talk on the telephone, or I'll listen to a podcast, or I'll listen to music, or I'll listen to book tapes, or the best work I do is first thing in the morning when, sometimes I'm still in my pajamas or something. I haven't even had any coffee, and I couldn't put 2 and 2 together if I had to, because, my mind is still in that sort of somewhere between sleep and awake and still kind of fuzzy. And I walk out to my studio, which is close to my house, and I don't turn on anything, it's just the sounds that are outside or around me. And that sometimes, I'll paint for an hour, and that'll be the best work I do all day. It's just the most honest and fresh and free work that I do all day. I feel like I have the skills or the tools or whatever it is to resolve something that I might have been stuck on for the last few days. So I try not to think about anything, which is, it's hard. It's really hard to.
Yeah.
from that non-thinking place.
I have such a hard time controlling the monkey mind, or, whatever you want to call it, the lizard brain, the little squirrels that are constantly running around in there. And now I'm kind of working on just this whole process of good or bad, just letting thoughts disappear, and trying to actively not think, I guess, like what you're saying, but, like not, notice that this thought came in and then just let it go without taking it to its conclusion, because my natural tendency is like, I need to solve the problem. I need to, like, any thought that comes into my head, I'm like, oh, okay, what's going on?
Yeah. What does that mean? Well, and that's that sort of meditative state, where you can let a thought pass through your brain, but you don't have to grab it and mash it to death. You just kind of come in and go out, and you can just sort of sit and watch it go. And I think that's fine. And it's a great thing to learn to be able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I got to the point where, like, I was good with negative thoughts. Like, I was very, very conscious of that. And I didn't realize that even neutral or positive thoughts can take you down, like pull you away or lead you somewhere where you don't really need to be at that moment. So that's something that's kind of obvious, but new to me.
And it never becomes, at least as far as I can tell, even, that we know these things intellectually, it never becomes something that's completely second nature,
No.
I think it's just our brains, and we can be our own worst enemy and our cruelest critics, and it's a battle.
Yeah. When you're going into your studio and you're working on these paintings, and I'm really curious, as somebody who comes from, like, I'm in the representational space, so there's a moment or a sensation that I'm after based on something representational. So when you're there in front of your canvas and you're not thinking, I'm having a hard time understanding what you do. And that sounds really blunt and cruel, but it's not meant to be. But, like, are you starting with an emotion? Are you starting with a color theme? Or are you literally just going like, okay, blank canvas, blank palette, I'm going to follow my intuition and go where it leads me?
Yes, to all of the above.
Wow.
And my answer is not even going to be that clear, because part of my process is, one of the things that I'm addicted to is experimentation, and experimentation in materials and processes. And I think part of that keeps me really engaged in the process, that sense that, going down a different path may have a different outcome, or I might learn something new, or I'll either do the worst painting I've ever done or the best, or somewhere in between if I'm lucky. So literally I don't even start the same way every time. Like, sometimes I'll start with mark, with a mark making tool. And my process is really physical. Like, I like to work as large as I can, and I'm really working fast and, making big gestural, movements and swaths of paint and, whatever. So sometimes I'm doing that with the canvas on the wall with the mark making tool. And then the next time I might start with the work on the floor and pouring paints and glazes and kind of moving them around the canvas that way. Or I might be experimenting with sticks or rollers or some found thing or something, trying to create. And it's a little bit of a science project, I think.
How fun.
Yeah, it's really, really fun. And I think fun is a big part of the process that, that I love and that keeps me engaged. And sometimes I will have a preconceived notion, but it rarely goes beyond maybe a color palette, or that I am going to start with 4 or 5 different mark making tools and just kind of keep pushing those marks to see what new textures or what kind of energy they convey. But even when I think I'm going to start with often I think I'm going to start with a red palette or something. And then the next thing you know, I'm pouring, black paint on there instead of the red.
Right.
So I don't even seem to be able to control that. I'll tell you what, one of the things that I'm really for the last few years, I've been really aware of doing and really sort of fascinated by that process of synesthesia where, literally your one sensation is being interpreted as a different sense. So true synesthetes, as they say, like, maybe every time they see the color green, they smell that smells like lemon.
Oh, okay.
Like literally where you're like transposing different audio or visual or oral sensations in a different sense. So because where I live out, in this rural area, I'm constantly surrounded by, wind and snow or things rustling or birds or, and that backdrop of noises and smells and sights and sounds at one point I just became aware that was really directing and informing my work more than anything else. That I was kind of trying to paint those blackbird noises or the color of the wind or, that scratchiness that dry branches make. I was like, what does that look like, that scratchiness? So, I just try and kind of tune into other things outside of my head, I think.
Right. Okay. Now I'm starting to get a clear picture. I got it.
It's crazy. It's a crazy way to work, but it is fun.
I don't think it's crazy. I think you're just tuned into, I was about to say like you're just tuned into a different channel, but that also could be interpreted as being crazy. I don't mean it that way. I just mean it like, it's like a different language. I mean, I guess that's the easiest way for me to sort of understand it. Because my husband's from Argentina, his native language is Spanish. And actually right now his brother is visiting us. So right now we are both like going back and forth between English and Spanish all the time. And it literally is a different language, but also everything about it is different. The way you express yourself is different, and the interpretations and the word orders, everything is different, but it's still a beautifully rich and deep language. And we both always run into this thing where there are some things that cannot be said in English. And then there's some things that just cannot be said in Spanish. And so since we're both completely, he's more bilingual than I am. He's much better at English than I am at Spanish, but we run into that frustration a lot of not being able to say that. But since we both know both languages, we can switch back to the other one and then explain it in the language that works. But I think that sort of analogy of language works really well with painting and what we're talking about.
Exactly. I was going to say that's a perfect analogy because, basically that's what I'm trying to do all the time is trying to tell a story or have a conversation. And how am I going to do that in an abstract or non-representational way? What tools do I have? Whether it's texture or mark or composition, how can I get that story across? And it's like, how can I make myself understood, when we're not even speaking the same language sort of, and, it's a really rich way of communicating, and it does feel so universal, or
it's more primal, right? I mean, because we existed before we had language to communicate with each other, right? So human beings, like we found ways to communicate before we had, developed languages. And if you want to even pull it into current times, babies, I think, are just insanely intelligent.
Right.
And, my personal take is the reason why they cry and scream so much is because they're just like, I know the answer.
Exactly. It's just that sort of level of frustration.
Yeah.
And being able to make themselves understood, and they're just, they know exactly what they're trying to say. And as artists, I think we know what we're trying to say as well. And, how are we what tools do we have to accomplish that and to make our point and make ourselves heard and understood, and that we have something valid to say. So.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's kind of like that old saying that, what is it? It's something like if you're a carpenter, then everything looks like a hammer or a nail or something. It's something like that like basically, do you know what that saying is? I'm totally botching it.
I can't explain it any better than you did, but it is how you look at the world through, your own perspective. And, as an artist, you look at the world through paint and mark and, how you...
Not in visual, not using language or not using words.
Not using words, yeah. If we were authors, I'm sure it would be completely different.
I don't know. Then we'd be looking for the perfect word.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be looking for the perfect word. Or if you're a musician, you'd probably... everything in the world would probably be, musical to you, sounds.
Well, that's what you're talking about, right? Like the scratches of the trees and the birds and the wind.
Exactly, yeah.
Can you talk about what are you working on right now, or what are you currently just obsessed with, if I haven't already asked you enough?
Well, I've got a couple of different things. I've actually got 2 paintings and a drawing on the wall. And I love to draw. I love paper. I love mark. I love the whole process of drawing. But I don't get to do it very much. And so that's been one of my goals for the year, is just, even though I don't really have a market for my drawings, started to create a body of work on paper, just because I love it. And so that's real freeing, to think that everything you do doesn't have to be predestined to go somewhere or do something. You just have that, it's such a luxury to have the freedom to just paint or draw what you want. And so the drawings are really sort of personal and special, because they're, the nature of a drawing is that you can't beat it to death. It's got to be quick, and it's got to stay fresh. Mm-hmm. So, those drawings happen pretty quickly, and you have that hand of the artist in there that I love. And so that's something that I have going on. And then I'm trying to take some of what I love and learn in that drawing process and capture it and keep it in the paintings as well, find that sort of, that point where, it sort of straddles painting and drawing. So I'm working on that, and I've got a show coming up in February at one of my galleries my gallery in Dallas, and so I'm working on a body of work for that show.
So that would be February 2017, and what's the gallery that you're showing at?
That's at the Craighead Green Gallery in Dallas, Texas.
Cool. So if anybody is in the Dallas, Texas area, you know where to go.
Yeah, that's a great area. It's down in that design district, and they have these, the art openings are just really well attended, and people just roam the streets and go in and out of galleries. So it's real fun. I don't know what it'll be like in February. It might not be so fun.
A little cold.
But people do come out for them, and, so it's a really nice spot.
Very cool. Krista, thank you so much for spending this much time with me. It was great talking to you.
It was great to talk to you, Aunt Teresa. I'm a big fan of your blog, and it's just a great thing that you're doing, talking to artists and getting them to open up about their process. So, I'm really honored to be one of the interviewees.
Well, thank you. And we also have Rhonda Doré to thank for giving me your name.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. Thank you again to Krista Harris for sharing her insights with us. You can go to savvypainter.com and click on the podcast link where you will find the show notes for this episode. That includes Krista's paintings. You'll find links to connect with her on social media and her website, plus links to all of the other artists that we talked about and the books too. If you've been listening to the podcast or are subscribed to the mailing list, then you know that I've been working on a very special program for you that is coming up soon.
For months, I have been hard at work in my studio, building a program that will help you with painting techniques, getting your work out, finding collectors, and expanding your network. So I'm carefully designing this program to teach you the small baby steps that, when done consistently, add up to giant leaps in your studio and business. It's an ongoing membership program for artists. We will be covering painting and creativity, getting your work out, and promoting yourself, all within a supportive community. So if you want more information on this, you can put yourself on the early bird list at savvypainter.com/early bird. As I get closer to the launch date, you will be the first to know, and you will be eligible for the lowest possible price. If you want to be a part of this exclusive group, again, it's savvypainter.com/early bird. And I want to take a quick moment to thank some very special people. First of all, to Rhonda Doré. As always, thank you so much, Rhonda, for being such a big supporter of this podcast and for suggesting Krista as this week's guest. Also, a big thank you to Gaela Irwin, Karen O'Connell, Kathy Naus, Alchemy Works, Jeanette Gray Art, Patricia Matranga, Deb Cook-Shapiro, Denise Klitzy, Christine Rasmussen, Greg Decker, Barbara Chantray, and Ginger Dance. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast. I so appreciate your contributions. Next week, Jennifer Poczynski will be my guest. Until then, this is Ann Trees Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thanks so much for listening.